Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Wednesday, April 23rd, 2025. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Senior editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
And joining us today, a very old friend, a longtime colleague. We worked together at the New York Post. We have worked together here at Commentary over the last 16 years. American, British, swashbuckling, movie critic, foreign correspondent on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places, and the author, primary author of the report issued by the UK Parliamentary Committee on October 7th that was chaired by our other mutual friend, Lord Roberts of Withmondshire, or known to you as Andrew Roberts, the great historian. Jonathan Foreman. Johnny, welcome to the Commentary Podcast.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here.
Jonathan is here because he is the author of the, aside from all of the good reasons that he would be here otherwise, author of the cover story in our April issue, which is called The Untold Story of How Israel Failed on October 7th, and is a narrative account of what he and this parliamentary commission discerned and discovered in the course of trying to render an accurate account of the intelligence, military, logistical, and political and social events that led up to Israel being surprised on October 7th and what the consequences of those were. And it's an extraordinarily important article, and we will get to it in a minute. Before we talk about how 91 days into the Trump administration's promise that it would solve the war in Ukraine on day one, the declaration, and it's very hard to kind of parse the meaning of it. Basically, the declaration that they're done. They're washed. There's going to be some negotiations today, but it's all like the cleaning lady and the garbage man and the fourth ranking person in the cultural affairs department are all going to sit around a table talking about things because Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, and others have made it clear that there is no negotiation to be had. Nothing's happening. And so the solution to the war that nobody asked Trump to provide, right? This was his unilateral campaign promise that he would end the war on day one, that he has now failed to achieve this campaign promise, that I don't think Putin was seeking, nor was Zelensky, very obviously, since the solution on day one would be to make Ukraine lose the war. And apparently it's now come a cropper on the entirely preposterous grounds, preposterous in the context of ending the war on day one, that all Ukraine needs to do is accede publicly to the annexation of Crimea, which I think makes up 20% of the territory of Ukraine or something like that. All they need to do is just say, okay, you can have Crimea. Thanks so much. That's why hundreds of thousands of us have died over 3 years, is to assent to the partial destruction of our country by a completely, by a depraved and depreded Russian military. And Zelensky said, we're not going to do that. Like, maybe, not that he's saying this explicitly, but look, maybe you can win this in a war. Maybe you can beat us in the war. But we're not going to ever say that Crimea is not part of Ukraine. And just as the world did not accede to the Soviets taking over Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, if you will remember, we called them captive nations. We did not recognize Soviet dominion or the Soviet takeover of them, and we accepted their currency. They had an exiled government that we recognized, the West recognized for more than 4 decades until the fall of the Soviet Union meant that those countries then again became independent, so independent that my daughter, who was studying abroad, is about to go to Tallinn for a couple of days as part of her semester, her junior year abroad. Imagine my saying that to you in 1987. Oh, my daughter's just going to go to Tallinn for a couple of days, and then
Yeah,
she'll be back.
I went to Vilnius last summer actually to sort of,
Ah,
which is sort of
yeah.
weird, and it was
Well, I've never been, but like everybody I know who is in the foreign policy, I go to lots of conferences world and we sit and we have rapporteurs and we issue statements. Has been going to Riga and Tallinn and Vilnius and all these places, and so
Tallinn is
I've
so
never
hot
been.
right now.
Very hot, but I've
yeah,
never been. But I will say that when I was looking at the pictures of Tallinn, I don't know why I'm going on this because just why
yeah.
not? Because it's a podcast. It looks like Cinderella's castle at Disney World. It looks like a storybook kingdom out of a full pop up book that you fold open, and this is where Elsa and Anna live in Frozen. You know, it's kind of
I went there
amazing. I
20
hope
years
she enjoys it.
I was there 20 years ago, and it's a Cinderella castle. If you can imagine this a city being populated entirely by amazingly good-looking people, I mean, it was
Well,
as
I mean, you think
yeah,
what Elsa and Anna aren't
yes,
and
yeah. And
Cinderella
no,
aren't good
very,
looking?
yeah, it's
Okay,
actually just
yes,
like a movie. Like the
okay,
girl
there you go.
selling you stuff on the sidewalk is like you think I could bring her to the US and make a fortune as her manager. You know that's what it's like. Or it
Okay,
was like.
so anyway, and so Ukraine not noted, especially noted for the pulchritude of its people, but nonetheless, Crimea is part of Ukraine. They're never going to give it up. This is, they will lose it, but they're never going to accede to its. And Zelensky would fall if he said, "Yeah, you can have Crimea."
I reckon they could.
So
Do you think that they might be able to get it with Crimea, but Eastern Ukraine is even harder to sell, isn't it? When it's up,
well, I don't
that's
even think they're. I mean, that's not. I mean, the focus of the conversation is
yeah.
Crimea. Anyway, the whole
Well, the
point here
Trump the
is that
Trump the Trump proposition is
Crimea.
is Crimea, but is not going. The deal wouldn't ask the Russians to leave any place that they currently are, so that the rest of Ukraine, Trump is sort of getting away with. Well, you don't have to turn the territory over to Russia. We won't recognize it as Russian territory, but we're not going to ask the Russians to leave. So
Yeah, we're not asking the
six
Russians
months
for
from
anything.
now, 6 months from now,
Yeah,
that territory will also be annexed by
yeah.
hook or by crook.
Look,
Yeah,
it's a yeah.
to the outside world, I think if you're outside of Ukraine, you think, well, Crimea began long ago, so that's a foregone. They can forget about that. But when you're over there, it's blasphemous to talk in those terms. There's absolutely no giving of Crimea. It's tempting to say that Trump went about the entire supposed peace deal the wrong way from the first step, except the very proposition was wrong to begin with. It starts before the first step. You're not going to have a peace deal with Vladimir Putin and Ukraine when, as you said, it would simply mean Ukraine saying, "Okay, we're done. We lost. We give up what hundreds of thousands have died to defend."
I hate to put it this way because it sounds cold, but if Ukraine is willing to suffer the horrific losses that it is suffering, the idea that the president of the United States comes in and says there's too many people dying there, so I have to stop it, is actually kind of jaw dropping when
Yeah.
you think about it. Imagine if the same conversation had taken place about Afghanistan in 1983 or something like that. Reagan had said, it's just the poor Afghani people. They're just suffering and the Russians too. A lot of Russians are dying and the Afghanis. And it's like, no, we're fine. Look, I'm not going to talk about what happened after the Russians lost in Afghanistan. Bad things happened to the United States as a result of the, follow on after that. But it's like, it's not our choice whether Ukrainians want to fight a war to save their country. And there is plenty of history, like Afghanistan, to assume that if they hold tight and bog the Russians down, the Russians will give up. they don't have any. They don't have anything to give up. Like they're living where the war is taking place. All they can do is surrender and become, live under the Russian jackboot. So
It's also very weird, isn't it, to come, after all that isolationist rhetoric, to sort of go like, we don't want to be the world's policeman. We're going to pull back to like, then this incredibly imperialistic thing where you go like, oh, by the way, we think there's too much killing going on, so I'm going to make you stop and surrender, essentially. And it's
Yeah, and not only that, but what's the plan with the nuclear, the area around the nuclear plant, right? Trump's like, well, we'll take it. America will buy in, and we will have the area around the nuclear facilities, and that's what will protect the nuclear facilities from Russian attacks. Because if they're American, they won't. So we went from America first, and pulling back from the world to, we're going to occupy part of Ukraine. Russia's going to occupy part of Ukraine. Maybe Ukraine will get some of Ukraine too. We'll see how things shake out. But like all of a sudden, he's decided that America is going to set up shop at one area where they're worried about Russian attacks. So pick a lane.
Right. This is a very important point, because the one thing that we can say of a certainty from the beginning of the war in February 2022 until now is that not a single American footprint, I mean, there's probably covert, there may be covert people running over, but not a single American military footprint has been in place on Ukrainian soil in the course of this war. And Trump, as you say, is talking about putting, I assume, what would be hundreds, if not thousands, essentially, of armed forces to protect whatever it's called, Graposhnitschia. I'm just making up words. This is the podcast in which I make up words and names and titles for Andrew Roberts's baronetcy or whatever the hell it is.
Belgravia, incidentally.
Well, Belgravia is even funnier, of course, because Belgravia is a series of houses in London, basically.
Yeah.
It's white, beautiful white houses from the 1820s. That would be like calling me Lord Podhoretz of the Upper West Side, but or 86th Street or something. But anyway, it's not to make fun of Andrew Roberts, one of my favorite people, but I can't help it. Anyway, but I'm just making up words like the name of the nuclear plant. But yeah, so suddenly there's no Americans, and we're just giving them weapons so that they can try to win this war. And now they're going to lose according to the Trump philosophy, which is actually not going to take place here. They're going to lose the war. They're going to lose 20% of the country. The rest of the country is going to be a lot of the country is going to be semi-occupied by the Russians, and they're going to be totally at Russia's mercy. And there are going to be 5,000 Americans surrounding the nuclear plant. So every single aspect of the Trump promise is betrayed. Biden didn't have Americans on the ground. Trump will bring Americans on the ground. Biden didn't, you know what I mean? Like, whatever Biden did, he didn't say you can have Crimea, And again, the Ukrainians want to keep fighting. If they want to sue for peace, they can sue for peace without us. We have literally this is not our fight. It's their fight. If they want to say to Russia, okay, uncle, we can't handle it anymore. It's one of the worst pieces of foreign policy gamesmanship we have ever seen, as far as I can tell.
And he doesn't mean it anyway, does he? I mean, it's BS, right? It doesn't really, obviously, he doesn't really care about the amount of people who've been killed. I mean, it's just a sort of weird way of giving.
He doesn't it's a mess.
Right.
It's a mess, and he could clean up the mess, and then maybe he could win a Nobel Prize by cleaning up the mess, or some version of that. And it was a theme. It was just a rally campaign theme, which is Biden's terrible at everything. He screwed up Afghanistan. He screws up everything. He screwed up you. I could solve this in a day. In a day, I could solve it. You don't have to vote for Biden. I'll fix it. And now it's 90 days in, and he's like, well, I guess I'm not going to fix it. I have cockamamie schemes to fix it. And Marco Rubio, his Secretary of State, is saying, I'm not even going to meet with these people. What we need to do is get the hell out of here and just get back to now it's terrible because it's either terrible because we're not going to supply them with the weaponry that they need, clearly. On the other hand, maybe Europe will, or maybe Europe will do what it can, or there'll be some kind of weird pipeline where Europe buys the arms and then it gives them to Ukraine, and we're like, we didn't know they were going to give it to Ukraine. I don't know how it's going to work.
Yeah.
It's a horrible situation. It's a terrible thing. We snatched defeat from maybe not from the jaws of victory, but from something for no reason, like a lot of what's happened now over the 90 days of Trump's presidency,
Yeah.
right?
And
Where
there's also
you cause a stock market crash, and then the stock market comes back, and then you're like, oh, the stock market is coming back, but it wouldn't have fallen 6,000 points if it hadn't been for your stupid Liberation Day,
yeah,
So
and there's also not just the facts of the results of this process in Ukraine and what it means for Russia, but it's what the U.S. has broadcast this whole time as well during this failure that will have consequences for us. I mean, we've been going around to flattering Putin, trying to ingratiate him, trying to get him back into the G7. It says a lot about where we are now too. It puts us in a different position vis-a-vis the world's bad actors, and with nothing to show for it.
And also I know Trump doesn't understand the whole idea of alliances at all. It doesn't mean it's like doesn't get it. It's like a lot of things he doesn't understand. But at some point, it's going to matter that no one trust. I mean, this trust deficit. No, everyone is thinking, Jesus, anything could happen. Do you know what I mean? It's like maybe we should be friends with the Chinese. I mean, or maybe we should. These. They could. It could. What if it gets worse? You know what I mean? What if he wakes up one day
right.
and you know, he probably
that's
won't.
happening. That's happening right now, right? We have weird alliances being made. Iran and Saudi Arabia have made an alliance. Or Iran and Russia have made an alliance. China is going all over the place, and this idea of trying to secure your supply chain in the world of tariffs. If there's going to be this worldwide crisis engineered solely by one guy's flippancy and anyway, it is an amazing set of circumstances, and it is like Trump has now spent 2 months punching himself in the face, and then yesterday maybe he went on a new med and he stopped and he was like, no, I'm not going to fire Jerome Powell. I have no intention of firing Jerome Powell. And Scott Bessent is going to Wall Street and telling people that everything's going to be fine. And so things kind of calm down. It's like, hey, look, everything's great. I stopped punching myself in the face. Now I'm not being punched in the face. Wow, what a victory for me that I stopped punching myself in the face. So that is the 3-month mark of the Trump administration. Okay, let's move on to the untold story of how Israel failed on October 7th. So, Johnny, give us what was the commission that you went to work for, and
Sure.
what was its purpose, and how long did you do this investigation? And it came out in March, right?
Yeah, it came out in March, mid-March. Yeah. Well, it was a report put out by I think called the All Party Parliamentary Group for UK Israel, which is a group of members of Parliament and members of the House of Lords. And there are lots of these things. There's an APPG for Kurdistan. I went on a trip to Kurdistan with them. And that's weird. They're not official parliamentary commissions, which need the government to, which have to be voted on. They're more like sort of caucuses. They're more like, I guess it's between a caucus and a lobby group within the parliamentary system. And this one has a lot of basically pro-Israel, relatively pro-Israel, I'd say. Not some of them are, not. They're not exactly. It's not an ardently Zionist organization, but it's a sort of relatively pro-Israel MPs and members of the House of Lords. And there's 40 of them. It's one of the largest ones actually in Parliament. They wanted to do a report that would sort of establish what happened, when, where, and precisely because we've had a whole lot of news reports, but we didn't have. It hadn't all been put together. I mean, in Israel, it'll happen in 4 or 5 years. There's going to be an official document, and the National Library's doing it, and it'll, and everything will be put together. But what gave it the impetus was a poll that came out, which said that something like at least a quarter of British Muslims believed that it hadn't happened at all, that nothing had happened, that the Israelis had just attacked Gaza for nothing. You know what I mean? They actually believed that. I'm sure there's a whole lot of other people who believed it happened, but it was right to happen. There's always that, like 9/11. But it's and people thought, Jesus, and there was so much arguing about, you know, this is all just propaganda, etc. Okay, let's do it. Let's just give it chapter and verse. Well, every single incident will have to be properly verified in a sort of quasi-academic way with lots of stuff to back it up. And it will only examine what happened on the day and like the 2 or 3 days afterwards, the actual attack. And it won't ask why. So there's nothing about the long-term stuff, nothing about Gaza. It won't ask what went wrong, which is my article was about. That came up, but no, we just wanted to know what happened when. And it was before most of the Israeli IDF, any one had come out, the one from Kibbutz Be'eri. So it was just looking basically at all the sources that have been done. And that includes endless newspaper reports, of course, and TV stuff. But also lots of oral testimony. The Shoah Foundation at USC has been collecting hundreds of these things from people who lived out there. And all sorts of other private and public groups have been collecting testimonies. And of course, an incredible amount of video evidence. There's never been an event, a violent event that has been as filmed, as comprehensively as this. By far, in all of human history, there's never been. That's the amazing thing about anyone doubting it. It's like, it's all there, and at least a third of the footage comes from Hamas itself, comes from the killers. You know what I mean? It's like those few incidents where the Nazis film themselves, it's like, but here on a huge scale. So plus you've got, CCTV footage everywhere in Israel. You've got everyone's carrying mobiles and, it's just this sort of, and dash cams, because Israelis all have dash cams on their cars, like that sort of stuff. And so there's this endless footage. So you just take it in and you put it, well, this happened where and when, and establishing the time where things happen in each place, and making sure that, because things happen in about 30 kibbutzim and moshavim, 3 cities, about 12 army installations, and to put it down for each one, because otherwise everyone knows about Be'eri and Kfar Aza, but no one knows about these other places, and stuff happened in those other places, and it's just get it down while it's fresh. And the idea, it's a bit like we were all very mindful of the fact that that whole thing with Eisenhower when they arrived at Buchenwald. And they were like, they dragged all the locals in to see it. But then he had this thing where he brought a whole division of American troops to come through because he thought, and as he said, no one's going to believe this. And which came true, of course. He said, we've got to have. So it probably was an amazing thing that you had 10,000 American troops who could come back to towns all over America and go, no, I've seen it. It's real. And so that was really part of the idea, is like, get it there, and have chapter and verse, and it'll be a useful document when anybody writes about it in the future. So that was the idea. And it took. I came on board in the midsummer last year. They've been thinking about how to do it. And we went to Israel for too short a time, just for a few days, and went, but team Andrew, myself, and a chief researcher called Sydney Arnold, and some local people. And we went down, we saw Kfar Aza and Be'eri, we went to the Nova site, and then we visited people, like we went to, see the chief pathologist of Israel. And I don't know if you've ever been to a pathologist's office. It's kind of just like on TV in the movies, because they are people who are extraordinarily calm about really awful things. Do you know what I mean? And make jokes about things like, oh, it's so rare to be, near so many living people, that kind of thing. And they do live in this sort of strange world. And then they showed us stuff, which we couldn't take away most of it, but it was, because a lot of people did all the military personnel was scanned, that sort of thing with CAT scans and things. A lot of the civilians weren't. But, you see these terrible things, like you see a scan of a woman's body and it's got nails throughout the whole, reproductive tract, that kind of stuff, because someone's used a nail gun. Unfortunately, there's not enough evidence of that stuff because people were buried very quickly. It was very hot.
Well, it's also Jewish law. It's also Jewish law that it's 24 hours you're supposed to be buried within.
Yeah.
People don't know this, but according to religious Jewish law, the body is supposed to be interred 24 hours within 24 hours of the death. And so as a result of pathology, some of this pathology stuff was just not done, because also there is a hesitancy to do autopsies, like for this very reason. There are religious objections to autopsy.
actually, there's a couple of, actually should be interesting for you to meet. There's a woman who I met who was a reservist, but part of the kind of rabbinical chaplaincy in the army. They actually followed the bodies the whole way through to make sure that they were being sort of respected. And that was very important. And it's Israel, so everyone's so mindful of the families and stuff too. They were examining them. There was so many coming in, and they'd moved all these facilities down to the south. That unfortunately, at some point, somebody, no one knows quite who, but possibly a police officer said, there's not enough time. Let's stop doing these checks on the bodies. And that meant, of course, that when the whole rape discussion started, the evidence wasn't there anymore. So people go, it didn't really happen and all that stuff. Of course, no one ever asked those questions about, the rapes in Bukhara or the rapes in the Balkans, but it's different. And that was unfortunate. So there is this sort of, but the pathology stuff just showed that you've read the stuff, we showed us pictures of, weird stuff where, a couple are tied with wires to two sides of a mattress, and then it's set on fire. And there's a lot more burning. I mean, I have to say the one thing, it's slightly unfair of me to do this, but I figure I watch so much horrible video and seen so much stuff that I can't help but slightly share it and give everyone else a little taste of it. But there's much more burning than you imagine, and cars catching fire and stuff. And then, as you point out, the thing about the 24 hours, it's the same in Islam, of course. And I think the Hamas people, one of the reasons they and their followers did so many revolting things in terms of mutilating bodies, post-mortem usually, and chopping bodies up or mix, is because they knew. And they knew it would be especially distressing. I mean, that it's proper terrorism in that way. They knew, so we're going to mix up these bodies. It's going to take people ages to sort out which bits belong to whom, and also and they knew about the whole Jewish idea of the wholeness of the body being important, because it's the same in Islam. And so they said, we're going to make this as distressing as possible. It's incredible. It's vindictive even beyond the killing in itself, and that's and it becomes very clear that was the pathologist thing. And then, we did other interviews and things. It was.
Well, I just want to say, there's a weird point about this in terms of the question of the public discussion of just how evil the attack was, and just the nature of the evil is, and how it was impossible for people either to take it in, or that the propagandists on the other side were so resolute about denying that anything had happened that at some point a report came out that they had discovered bodies of infants who had been cooked in ovens.
Yeah.
And it was true. But as you say,
I'm not sure that was true. I think there were these things, part of that. I mean, there were two problems, I think. One is that there were tons of rumors flying around, as you can imagine. Right. And some of them were picked up.
Yeah.
There doesn't seem to be any evidence that we could find about anyone being cooked in an oven. I mean, a lot of people.
Well, I mean, they didn't have. Yeah.
So many people were burned. And they used
burned, or they stuffed in an oven, whatever. And then so I did a tweet where I said they burned a baby in an oven or something like that, and there were 2,000 angry responses about how I was a propagandist, defaming the,
There's enough. I mean, I guess,
even right. So even if it were not true, but I mean, the idea that someone might have shoved the corpse of a baby in an oven somewhere. I mean, even if it wasn't burned in the oven, whatever, it doesn't matter. Yeah. It's not like.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? And we were very
several dozen babies weren't murdered on.
No, so many, exactly. I mean, there was it's a shame that some of those things became so current, because it undermines the stuff, because there's so much real stuff that's just as bad or worse that, right. And it spread through. And unfortunately, a lot of the stuff came from these guys from the Zaka volunteer organization. Do you know what they are? They're these. They do a lot of digging people up. They're mostly ultra orthodox. Weirdly, there's some Muslims in it too, but and they're not. They don't do exact stuff. That's not their culture in a kind of way. So they'd say things like, even when we talk to them, it's like, oh, it was really, really terrible. I can't even tell you how terrible it was. And you go, well, tell me. It's terrible. And then it was just this sort of, and.
Yeah.
There's a modesty associated with Zaka, their entire purpose, like why they exist is a sort of, and so it's very hard. they
Right.
mix the two, and
Well, we should explain
they don't
because
really know.
it goes to the nature of a civilized society obeying or following very ancient rules,
Yeah.
dealing with this very modern attack. So Zaka literally collects remains for burial. So, and it had to find, because you mentioned this, they chopped things up in order to make this as difficult as possible. They had to essentially, they pick up
Oh, body
blood,
parts, bits,
like they
blood,
scrape
bits,
blood
particularly. Yeah.
off a floor
Mm.
in order to bury the blood with the
Yeah.
body that the blood came from. It is an effort to make sure that the whole body is buried because of all sorts of reasons, but also ideas about what would happen should there come a resurrection at the end of times, and ancient ideas about whether that the body needed to be whole and complete, which is why Jews don't do cremate, or religious Jews don't cremate
Yeah.
bodies, because the body is what you will be restored to at the end of days. Anyway, so the Zaka, like it's unbelievably noble work
Oh, it's
and
most
gruesome
extraordinary
and
thing.
horrible and very, as I say, the people who are doing it are unbelievably noble and
Yeah.
self-sacrificing. But as I
No,
say, but maybe not rapporteurs, maybe not,
no,
like
and
that's
not, and they
important.
weren't even thinking. Actually, no one was really thinking about gathering evidence for any
Right.
kind of legal thing or war crimes or any of that stuff. And it all had to be done at the same time. And people are, of course, it all happened within 24 to 48 hours of this stuff.
Yeah.
Some of the bodies weren't
And there
recovered.
was so much of it, right? I mean, that's
So
also
much.
part of
No
the
time.
challenge is
You're
the
overwhelmed.
overwhelming amount
Yeah.
Yeah.
to go through if you're going to go through
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
evidence, right?
Well,
Yeah, and
people
they
don't
have
know this also,
also.
but they were having funerals overnight at Mount Herzl at various places. They would have a funeral an hour to get the bodies into the ground. Like, and you don't bury people at 3 o'clock in the morning, but in order to fulfill this religious mandate, so like even the cemeteries were overloaded
Oh,
and urgent, and this, so anyway,
yeah.
harsh,
And
but you know what?
the
Yeah,
mobile morgues are overwhelmed. I mean,
yeah,
it's
yeah,
happening, and then there's all these people who are working on identification, which is really difficult. And they talked about that was a lot of the stuff that the pathologists talked about. It's incredibly difficult, and of course, people you imagine, as he explained to us, that having family identification is fine. It's not because people look different when they're dead. You know
yeah.
what I mean? And you know what I mean? And there were cases of people thinking, "Oh, this is my daughter," and it wasn't. And then they
Right.
find it through something else, like you know what I mean. And it happened several times.
And cases
Yeah,
where family members are thinking, well, either they're safe somewhere, they were kidnapped, or they were killed, and we don't know if they were
yeah,
killed.
Yeah.
So you have IDF crews sifting through ash,
yeah.
for
Yeah.
weeks to
For
find
yeah, to see if they could find a
teeth or
finger.
bones, it's something to
Yeah.
identify something. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
There
Well,
was
you know
one
what? So,
person who
so
got
this
away.
is, so all this is very important. And there are these movies that have been made, like there's a movie out now called October 8th, which opens this week, which is about the children of survivors of October 7th. As you said, the article that you wrote is
No,
about not the timeline or the chronology of October 7th to October 10th, when finally the IDF had subdued the Hamas
yeah,
invasion. People sort of forget that the south of Israel was not secured until October 10th.
yeah, very much not the
It
case.
was
They
not secured.
blasted.
They did not know there were thousands of Hamasniks roaming around in and around the Gaza envelope. Then they were on the run, and so they were hiding and stuff, or they went
Yeah,
back in
yeah.
when they could get to the fence. But it took 3 days for the military to declare that the invasion had been
Oh, yeah,
reversed or concluded. So now the question, and now we get to the question of your piece, which, as I say, is very, very important and very painful for people, which is what were what were the failures in Israel that led to October 7th happening? And for good and bad reasons, the good reasons being that Israel is in the middle of fighting a war and does not need to tear itself apart with a scourging internal investigation of 10 years of its conceptual failure to understand what Hamas was going for.
Yeah.
That can wait until the war is over and the reckoning can take place, though many people who hate the government and would like to see it collapse would like this to have happened as soon as possible so that everybody could get blamed, though so many people are implicated because it wasn't just Netanyahu wasn't just the leader of Israel uninterruptedly from 2009 to 2023, because there was this year and a half in which Naftali Bennett and Benny Gantz were Yair Lapid were the prime ministers of leaders of Israel, and they came from different parties, and so everybody's implicated. Everybody's implicated.
And not just them. I mean, it goes back further. I think it's a sort of everyone's implicated. I mean, of course, Bibi's implicated.
I mean, there's this fight, for example, people may be reading about that. Bibi is trying to fire the head of the Shin Bet, Ronan Bar, and he, bizarrely, you would think that this would be an issue since he's the prime minister of the country, but because of the demented policies in which the only check on the government is the Supreme Court, Bar seems to think that he can evade being dismissed by the elected prime minister of the country by saying he shouldn't be fired because that's bad. And there is actually a proceeding going on. But Bar, so he's the head of the Shin Bet, he's implicated. Every chief of staff of the armed forces dating back to 2000, dating back to the beginning of the tunnel system, is implicated. Every defense minister is implicated. Every foreign minister, everybody who has served in major positions in the defense of Israel over the last 15 years is guilty.
Yes.
Everybody.
I mean, so much.
This is kind of crazy.
Society. Yeah. I mean, and it's left and right because, I mean, of course, Netanyahu, he's heavily invested in the idea that, Hamas is tamed or, bribed, whatever it is.
He was, right.
Yeah,
before 20, yeah.
And he did have this idea that it was a sort of, this is a way of preventing, what he would have got a premature or, setting up of some kind of Palestinian state. You play them off against each other and all that stuff. Of course, that's the strategy, but it's not. But it wasn't just that. I mean, that's true, the stuff that people say about that. But of course, the left was also very invested in the idea of Hamas weakness because then it meant you can make certain concessions and that sort of thing. So everyone wants that to be true. And it means we can just concentrate on Iran. That's obviously a danger, and Hezbollah in the north, because, if you have to deal with a real threat in the south, it complicates everything. It's more, we have to start thinking about that stuff. And no one wanted to. I mean, it's like self-deception on this huge scale. And it's very weird because it's, people talk about, in terms of Hamas's intentions, it's not like they made a secret of it. I mean, it's like they say it again and again and again. Sinwar says no, because, when they ask him, so do you want to, we want to end the occupation? They say, do you mean of Gaza? He goes, no, of Palestine, the whole thing. They say it. I mean, it's like, yeah, we want to kill them. I mean, it's very strange. It's a bit like the British at various times in their colonial history. It's like they think, oh, these people just are excitable. They don't really mean what they say. No, they mean what they say.
And you talk about in the piece, you talk about literally there was this battle plan. Hamas produced a battle plan, and it fell into the hands of the Israelis, and they reviewed twice.
Yeah.
Ronan Bergman, I think you mentioned in the piece, reviewed. So it was already, connected journalists had already seen this. So this was not a super secret thing, but it was the battle plans, and then the spotters, the female spotters, I think it was, you say in the piece, noticed that Hamas was doing training sessions that looked like this battle plan, Jericho Wall or whatever the first iteration may have had a different name. I don't know.
But we should explain what you mean by the spotters. So literally, physically, along the border with Gaza, in the Gaza envelope, there were watchtowers.
There are watchtowers.
And watchtowers and video cameras.
Yeah.
And the people who manned the watchtowers and were watching the video cameras were 80 or 90% of them were women,
Yeah. From the observation.
IDF who were not, supposed to be in direct combat roles. And so they were women, and they were saying, I don't
Yeah.
know. They're like doing troop movements, and they're like marching back and forth, and they're approaching the fence and going back. And then everybody back at headquarters is like, what do they know?
No,
They're just kids.
And the
yeah,
crazy
They're
thing is that
girls
they
anyway.
had these plans and they
Yeah.
said like this matches this.
no, they
Now,
did. I
yeah.
mean, it was so crazy because you have in the sort of
So this is
in the
Roberta
intelligence.
Wallstetter's famous. Roberta Wallstetter wrote a famous book about Pearl Harbor called Pearl Harbor Command and Decision, one of the most important works in political science in the 20th century, which is
Who
about how you could not have seen Pearl Harbor coming. That in fact, ex post facto, you can say there are 17 different data points that suggest that the Japanese are going to attack Pearl Harbor. But in fact, without knowing that they attacked Pearl Harbor, those data points were not assemblable. And this is the problem with hindsight being 2020.
Sure.
Or
That
like
is
when they
not, yeah,
the Bin Laden determined to attack.
determined to attack, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
But yeah,
This
but
is not
this
like that.
is
right.
the opposite of that. In
Right.
other words, what they had was evidence that was irrefutable and that people saw with their eyes, that was 3 miles away, or half a mile away from a kibbutz. And back at headquarters, they said, nah.
And not even just at headquarters. The local commandos were like,
Oh, yeah.
they're like, it's those guys, and it's true. They're 18, they're conscripts, but it's been happening over months and months as they come through. And in the weeks before, they're seeing more and more stuff, and they're telling their parents.
Yeah.
They're saying things like, we're pretty scared. It's getting weird and scary.
And whatever age they are,
Yeah.
you put them there to do that.
Yeah. They didn't have the
You put them on the border and you said, you're going to be our eyes on the border.
That's the joke. This is a very important point, which is they essentially, it's clear, stopped having eyes inside Gaza.
Yeah.
Largely because they did not know about the tunnel system or the extent of the tunnel system, which means that their human intelligence inside Gaza was either totally turned or controlled by Hamas, which was feeding them false information, which is, again, an enormous intelligence failure. But you don't do that, and you're not doing all this high-tech stuff. It's coming online. It's going to come online next year. We have all this things that are going to determine this and that and the other thing. So what you have is conventional, old-timey people watching with their eyes from a watchtower. And then you don't listen to them.
Yeah.
Because they're not high-tech.
They're not high tech, and
So
they're
it's not coming from a satellite, so it doesn't count.
It's partly that they have that, and of course they do have, and they have the balloons, and they have all the cameras, and these are the people watching. They watch it 24 hours a day. Some of them are in the headquarters at Rayin Base, which got overrun. The others, and by the way, there's no reason to have those girls right next to them. They're watching feeds from a camera. They could have been in New York. I mean,
or Arizona, right? Which is where the drone, right? Which is where we're droning people in countries from a base in Arizona. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was weird to have them there, except I guess you're invested if you're sitting right there and you're going to be the first person that gets it. But so they are watching it. And it's like just baffling, like, well, you can't be right, because if you were right, it would mean that everyone else is wrong. And that just can't be that, it's like it upsets our whole idea of the world. So, you must be just wrong. And they actually, apparently people did use the word hysterical, where you think, oh my goodness. I mean, it doesn't have to be very woke to sort of find, do you know what I mean? Like,
calm down, ladies.
Yes, calm down, ladies.
But, I will tell you a funny story in this regard. My sister lives in Israel. Waze, GPS, right? GPS didn't quite start in Israel, but the map that talked to you, right, from your car, early 2000s, where would say turn right or turn left or whatever. You program it into your car before Waze, that thing, whatever, Garmin, or you put in your car. And so the first voice that was used in Hebrew was a female voice. Idea being it was non-confrontational, more pleasant to listen to. And after 6 weeks or 2 months, according to my sister, they had to change it to a male voice because the drivers would be going along and it would say turn left because there's traffic ahead, and the Israeli driver would go, what does she know?
Yeah.
What does she know? I'm not listening to her.
Yeah, it's like his
I know
wife.
the way home.
Yeah.
It would like violated the entire spirit of having this in your car, and so they had to change the voice to a male voice because the female voice lacked authority with too many people. That in small bore. This is 20 years before what happened with
Now
the
all
watching
Israeli
reporter.
GPSs are just Ariel Sharon's voice.
It's like,
That would be
it's
good. AI, an AI RL Sharon voice. Yeah.
like you could easily do it. I mean, it's like,
Yeah.
it's so crazy. I mean, that stuff is so crazy. And
Yeah,
there
but
was
can
a
you
big,
talk about Singapore? You partially begin the piece with a fascinating analogy, since I mentioned Pearl Harbor,
yeah,
and we say, well, Pearl Harbor is the example of the thing that you didn't stop and that was a big surprise. But you say Pearl Harbor is not a good analogy. There's an analogy that Americans do not know at
yeah.
all, which is Britain's what happened to Britain in Singapore in 1942.
Yeah, so Singapore in 1942 it's the biggest British base, naval base in all of Asia. It's the heart of the British Asian Empire. It's a sort of, it's there it is at the bottom of what was then Malaya, and they've got battleship space there, they've got aircraft. It's been a fortress that had been recently rebuilt like 20 years before with huge cannons on the front, and it was supposed to be, somebody said a few years before, oh, it's impregnable, and it was pretty clear that the Japanese were going to want to take it, but they said, well, it would be impossible for the Japanese to take it because to do that they'd have to come through the jungle, through Malaya, and there's not many roads, and that's impossible, sort of thing. They certainly couldn't do it, and anyway, it's so strong that they wouldn't even dare. And there was, there's a big garrison there and all the rest of it. It's strong, and also the Japanese anyway people actually said this stuff. It's sort of they're just not capable of doing this kind of thing. They're just not capable of this kind of ground warfare. And then they'd come up against our serious troops. It's impossible, and because it's impossible, no one really planned for them coming down overland through, from the north, because it's impossible. So you don't need to plan for it. You know what I mean? And what happens is this awful thing where they start coming down, with great ease, down through the thing, a lot of them, and even then, weird stuff happens where they don't prepare properly to defend the colony, and the people who the sort of smart planter types. So you can't dig trenches on the golf course. It'll ruin everything. They're never going to get this far anyway. I mean, like, weird stuff like that happens. No one's prepared. They come down, and in the end, the Japanese storm it. The guns are sort of either facing the wrong way or just useless when it comes down. These ultra-modern cannons they put in didn't make any difference because they didn't come by sea directly. They come in, and a much larger British sort of empire force ends up surrendering to the Japanese, a small number of them, and then taken to these prisoner of war camps where many of them are killed, and lots of this are horribly treated. And it's this incredible, humiliating thing. They're taken by surprise because they don't believe it's possible. They don't prepare for the unlikely. The quality of the actual fighting was terrible as well, with people running away and all problems like that. There was there's bad everything. This is what's so similar. So you have, even at the ground level, the combat performance isn't great. All the colonels and generals don't do badly. They don't prepare for the worst. They don't, and as a result, it's a huge disaster. It's the beginning of the end of the British Empire in Asia. I mean, it's so humiliating. The only people who fight are some of the Chinese communists who are there in Singapore. But everyone suddenly was, oh my God, these people are a paper tiger. They're weak. And this huge army just surrenders. It's and radical underestimation of the enemy as well, which is one of the things that happens so much here. It's like, and almost on a racial sort of level, and it certainly was a racial thing in Singapore. Like, these little Japanese, how could they possibly do it? I mean, and that people are still thinking that even after Pearl Harbor. You know what I mean? Yeah, they got lucky there, but you can't seriously treat these people as
So
the enemy.
errors, so the failings of on October 7th and do have these eerie parallels to this, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned that
Yes.
the military, one of the military bases in the South, which is a military base, it's a garrison, and has troops in it and everything, was not fortified.
Oh,
They didn't have foxholes. They didn't have trenches. They didn't have guns trained outward in case somebody tried to invade them. Because, of course, this had never happened, right? It had never happened that an Arab horde had invaded, except, during the war in 1948, when there wasn't even a country yet. There
Yeah,
hadn't been fighting on the ground in Israel that wasn't a conventional tank battle or something like
yeah,
that. And
exactly.
so they just didn't do it because it's like, we're not going to do that. What do we
Yeah,
do that for? Even though you're a military installation, and at the very least, you might want to do it because that's what you do on a military installation, and that also may have to do it when you go to the field. So maybe you want to teach people in on the base how to exist in a foxhole before
yeah.
you
Well,
have to
apparently
dig a foxhole.
and they had done it. I mean, for people I talked to, that used to happen. It used to be standard practice, like in the beginning of the century. You'd have the stand to at dawn, where everyone goes into their defensive positions, which is a standard thing in all militaries. You go at dawn, which is the most time, just before dawn, because that's we did when I was an embed in the U.S. Army. Like, you had to get up, before dawn and go and stand in the position even when you're out in the field, you have a sort of thing where the vehicles are in a circle and everyone goes to the position they would take if they were going to be attacked. And that had just sort of stopped. I mean, in theory, you're still supposed to, but no one had done it. It had just gone away. No one bothered because, like, what's the point? And some of those bases, I mean, it'd be harder to get into a US, the sort of corporate headquarters than some of these things. It's just a gate. Do you know
Yeah.
what I mean? With a guy standing there, and it's a sort of, and in that day, he wasn't even that. It was like they weren't proper. You go to any American military installation in North America, and there's going to be, it'd be much harder to get it. It's taken seriously, maybe too much so, but there they just didn't have enough. It's like this weird complacency,
And
and
people were away for, got weekend passes just as a matter of course. So, like,
yeah,
half of the active military is going home for Shabbat, and it
yeah,
was a holiday,
yeah,
right? It
Simchat
was Simchat
Torah.
Torah. So they're like, yeah, go home.
Yeah, and it's like,
Go home.
yeah,
It's not like there's any history of Arabs attacking Israel on Jewish holidays
yeah, that
or
would never.
anything that
Yeah,
you
that
might
would never.
want to not do it then.
I
Just,
mean,
It's not like 50 years ago today,
well,
in
and here's the
fact.
thing,
yeah,
So,
and
like,
literally 50 years ago to
no,
the day.
to the day. And you might think, well, okay, it's a different generation and all that stuff. But in Israel, there've been all these like conferences all about, the Yom Kippur, what are the lessons, blah, blah, blah,
Yeah,
for the last previous year. So you'd think it would be on everyone's mind, like, oh shit, oops, sorry, that's
it's
a,
okay.
maybe we should do stuff. And of course, the other side are very mindful of anniversaries. That's part of their culture, do you know what I mean, as well. So you'd think they would do, and again, like you think someone go, well, it is, it's possible. It could happen. The idea like they would never do it because it's unfair to attack on a religious holiday. I mean, it just seems so strange. I mean, who could be that? I mean, you'd have thought there'd be, that what Rumsfeld, called the known unknowns and the known unknowns. Like, well, it's really unlikely, but maybe just in case, we'll have some kind of plan for this. It'll never happen, but just they didn't do that. That's what's so baffling about it. There was none of that stuff. Like, yes, our primary enemies are in the north, but it could happen. Like just like every country's supposed to have its plans for, like, being invaded by Canada or whatever. I mean, it's sort of you have to have it. Do you know what I mean? It's like in somewhere, but in this case, it's on a dangerous border. It is. Why do they? You send everyone away, and people did say when we were interviewing, oh, well, it was Torah. It was like what? But it means, and there were so few there to begin with. That's the other thing. So you're cutting in half what really wasn't adequate anyway. And
Yeah.
one
that's
thing you keep describing is how well Hamas and the affiliated terrorist groups and
yeah,
Gazans in general know what Israelis are up to, know what Jews are doing, know what things mean, right? I mean, that's one thing that I
yeah,
get from this is you keep describing how they know when the bodies are supposed to be buried, and therefore they interfere with that in certain ways. They know what is happening on Jewish holidays. They pay very close attention to dates. They pay very close attention to anniversaries and and the symbolism and all this stuff. And it feels like one side is paying. You say in the piece, I think you say in the piece that Sinwar was far from the only. Yahya Sinwar, who planned the attacks, was far from the only Palestinian terrorist who learned to speak fluent Hebrew in Israeli prisons. Like, that's not, people look at that and go, wow, he really pulled something off there. But in fact, your point is that it's actually not that crazy. It's normal for these guys to pay close attention and learn and study their enemy which is the Israelis.
It is very important for people to understand. I know a lot of people who listen to this podcast understand because you have been to Israel and all of that, but most Americans have not. Most American Jews have not, for that matter. You can't grasp how close Gaza is. I mean, the city of Sderot, which is 22,000 people, is next to Gaza. And so they can watch Israeli TV 24 hours a day from Gaza. They can watch the news. The Israeli news is not at all hesitant about talking about all kinds of things. They can be incredibly intimately knowledgeable about life in Israel, and as you say, like Sinwar and hundreds of Hamas leaders lived in Israel in Israeli prisons, which are not, I'm sorry to say, given who Sinwar is, as savage as people think they are. They are conventional workaday prisons in a pretty informal country. I'm sure that life there is not horrific, by the way. I doubt that it's really like monstrous. It's not, it's not some concentration camp. And not only did Sinwar learn Hebrew and have these relationships with Israeli Arabs in jail and with Israelis and all that, but the Israelis cured him of his brain cancer and then released him to plan October 7th, which itself is the proof of concept that the concepcia that Hamas was constrained is ludicrous. They had made all these Hamas people literate in Israeli life and then sent them back to Gaza, where they could use their knowledge of Israel against Israel.
Yeah,
To say nothing of
say
nothing of the Gazans who went in and out of the border and understood the kibbutzim and what was happening there.
Yeah.
Oh, you have people work the 15 or whatever thousand or whatever it is of the work permits, and then people have been doing it before. And then, of course, people who are older knew that were there when the Israelis were still in Gaza. You know what I mean? So there was much more. There were a lot of interactions then for the older generation. So, of course, and by the way, it's the idea of these people. Oh my God, it's so shocking that they speak Hebrew and they know us. It was one of the things. That shouldn't have been a surprise, because in the 2006 Lebanon war, one of the things that went wrong is they found out that Hezbollah were listening in to the army radio, who just talked openly in Hebrew. It didn't occur to them that anyone would understand them, and like they weren't even using codes. It's like, do you think it's like this idea that the enemy are sort of stupid and illiterate and you know what I mean? It's like they're not, and they spend all their time thinking about this stuff. You know what I mean? It's and they're serious about it. So that was.
Can I ask you about that in terms of social media? Can you go into the social media aspect of that, because that was really interesting also in the piece where you mentioned specifically watching social media was enough for them to figure out where people would be and when, even around the bases and stuff like that.
Yes, and the Israelis use it so much, and they'd be on Facebook. They've been and there've been these cases in Israel too, where they found out, people have been with terrorism cases where they found out people being, catfished or whatever you call it, and that sort of, that. But no, they do for social media. And here's the weird thing is, the Israeli intelligence I guess it was about 4 or 5 years ago, stopped doing open source intelligence gathering in Gaza. Reading the newspapers and following them on social media. I mean, it's like, oh, we don't need to do that. You think this is just bizarre. I mean, you're so overconfident that it's criminal.
Well, in terms of what it means when you have an implacable foe that actually has a goal, right? That seems demented to us, which is the destruction of Israel. How are they going to destroy Israel? But they're implacable, and they have a multi-trillion. They have a country with a lot of oil that is sending them a lot of money.
Yeah,
they go there and they offer them the plan that Roman Bergman talks about. Give us $500 million and we'll destroy Israel. Here's our plan. They said to the Iranians. Hamas said to the Iranians, "We have a plan. It's really good." Even thinking through in the supposedly unconventional way that Israel supposedly does these things. So you say, okay, on the ground, they can't beat us on the ground, really, right? We can't do stuff in plain sight because they're watching. Although again, didn't they
Yeah.
didn't take into account the military actions. But like, we can't assemble a giant military complex because they have satellites on ground, and we keep firing rockets at them, but they shoot them down with Iron Dome. High tech stuff is real. Like, we're in the Stone Ages, they're in the 22nd century, but we can go underground. So there's the ground and there's the air, and then you know what? We've already signaled for 10 years that we understand that we have an intelligence advantage if we go underground. That's how we got Gilad Shalit. Dug a
Yeah.
tunnel, came out, pulled him through the tunnel, back in, held him for 5 years. There were tunnels from the Lebanon into Israel. There were tunnels from Gaza into Israel. There's this incredible tunnel system apparently now that goes into
Yeah.
Egypt. Smuggling tunnels that are wide enough for like literally 18-wheel trucks to go through. And the Israelis never caught into the fact that they were building this underground city for 10 years.
Well, they figured out about the attack tunnels. They built this amazing system with a fence that goes deep underground, and they had
Yeah.
the listening thing, so you couldn't use attack tunnels anymore. So they were able to
Right.
deal
So they
with that.
sealed off the passageway into Israel, but they
Yeah,
did not seal off the, sort of like James Bond lair that
no,
was subterranean Gaza.
no, they didn't do that, and they didn't seem to. And they knew there was some, but so much more than they realized. Because they found some in 2021, but it was much bigger. They built so many of them in such a short time. All that concrete and steel that obviously came in to do it, and it's so they're not really, they're not really paying attention to that. You mentioned earlier, I think it was Seth, the idea of the women who are watching that, but it's not just that watching and seeing things. Hamas filmed it and used it as propaganda. Like, we've made a mock-up of a kibbutz or an army base. Here are our super duper commandos taking it over, and then they use that as their own propaganda. So it's not, you really don't have to be a genius to figure that they're practicing for this stuff. Even if it hadn't been for the women, that the evidence that there was still more evidence of them doing that. And of course, the low tech, high tech thing, the Israelis have this faith in their high tech, but they somehow didn't notice that that the others, they didn't imagine somehow that the enemy would somehow get hold of a bunch of cheap drones, on the
Yeah.
internet, build them, you know what I mean, or whatever it is.
Or use a hang glider.
And the hang gliding things, there'd been these hang glider attacks years ago. Do you remember from
Yeah.
Lebanon into the thing? So
Sure.
again, it's not it's not like this unimaginable thing, that
Right.
sort of no one's ever.
And you have to practice. You have to train to use hang gliders. These
Yeah.
are
There was some German
motorized.
guy who
These are
taught-
motorized flying objects.
Yes.
It's not like holding up an
Yeah.
umbrella and you float.
Yeah.
And they must
Yeah,
have
but you
seen
do it over the sea. So it's like,
Right.
obviously, Gaza, they were doing it under cover of,
But they must,
fun Mediterranean Sea activity of a Sunday.
they must have been seen though. When you consider
Yeah.
how many they have
Right.
to have seen them and just
Right.
not put two and two together for
Yeah.
that reason. So you've got that.
One thing that all this stuff reminds me of is my friend in high school was a fantastic chess player, and I watched him at his public school. He was one of the captains of this public school chess team, and I watched them play practice once, and he, after the game, he would he very rarely lost, but he lost once. I watched him lose, and he reconstructed the game by memory. And after a while, I realized he was only partially reconstructing the game by memory. He was relying on what would a good chess player do in this situation. In other words, there was a whole long chess game, and he started from the beginning, and he got to the middle, and he was like, well, he wouldn't do that. He must have done this. He must have done this, right? And he was right most of the time, because this was the rare person on the chess team who could beat my friend, right? In other words,
That is a brilliant analogy. My son is a chess player. There's a brilliant analogy because, of course, chess, which is a war game, literally a war game, the first war game, or not the first, but like the first that was adopted in the West. So there are records of chess matches going back 300 years, and great chess players have memorized 300 years. If you're Bobby Fischer or one of these people, sort of like on the spectrum, like with Idiot Sovereignty, you've memorized thousands of games, so this piece moves here. There are these move from previous chess games, and then how does somebody become a genuinely brilliant chess player? Because they do something different.
Yeah.
And you don't expect it because you know every possible permutation of chess except the new one. So every successful military action, almost like every successful presidential campaign, involves adopting an innovative tactic that you should have been able to see, but you didn't because you were too busy thinking about the 800 years of the chess games
Yeah.
beforehand.
And the
right?
underestimation, right? I mean, he
Yeah.
would rebuild this game. It was this. You were essentially predicting the past.
Right.
What would he do here? And then you were right? Because but
Yeah.
it sounds like Israel was doing something very similar. Well, in this position, you would move the bishop here. Nobody in their right mind would move knight to f3 in this situation. And this seems to be a recurring theme in your piece, which is where, the Israelis seem to be looking for a mirror image. If we were in Gaza, right, what
Well,
would we do? That sort of thing.
Yeah.
And
except
where it's like you have to start to think completely differently from the
I'm
way
not,
you are trained to think.
Okay.
I'm not sure that's true. I think that the sort of one of the problems. I mean, there is. I think there was a thing. The projection thing was true in the sense of they thought, well, you know, we want. I think the projection happened in a different way. The projection was, look, they're making a lot of money now. That's becoming prosperous. Who's going to jeopardize all this stuff? If your main preoccupations are material ones, and you build a prosperity and everyone being happy and normal Western, capitalist, whatever you want to call it, sort of society. Like, of course, you don't want to wreck this, after years of poverty, this new life you've got. Who would do that? And they projected that on the other side. In military terms, however, I don't think that was the case. They didn't do that. I think the big fault they had is they didn't do what the US military calls red teaming. And red teaming is where you have, the red is it's how the US Air Force has its, the red squadron is on the other side. Basically, what you do is to figure out, so you have a whole bunch of your best people, if you're doing it right, and you say, you get to play the other side. You go away and figure out a way to beat us. You know us because you're them, and go and figure it out. And that's how you figure out what the enemy is going to. They didn't do that. They didn't even bother doing that.
But the Israelis had a fantasy, and we know this from our dear friend Dan Senor and Saul Singer's book, Startup Nation, that the Israelis have a self-understanding, in part promoted by Startup Nation, that they're very flat and that they are not hierarchical and they are not controlled by bureaucracies, and that the whole nation is red teamed. And that if you're somebody in the military and you see a better way to do it, you have very quick access to the top. And part of the reason that the country went into existential crisis after October 7th and the surprise nature of this attack is that its own vain self-understanding was totally shaken. That they were innovative, that they were fleet, that they didn't have the hidebound problems of old European or even American militaries and things like that. They could do all kinds of things that no one else could do. And it's true. They can do all kinds of things that no one else can do. But faced with a conventional attack by a conventional army on their border that they had decided wasn't a conventional army and couldn't stage a conventional attack, in very much in a manner of like Manassas or something like that. Like they were completely paralyzed. And that's where we get to the senior leadership thing. And we're running long, but let's talk about this a little bit. So the term in Israel about where Hamas was and how Israel should deal with it is the conceptia, right? The concept. And the idea was, we're going to hold them in place. They're going to keep firing missiles. Every couple of years, we're going to have to go in and take out their missile sites. And we'll say we're going to destroy them, but we're not really going to destroy them. And we want to, and that's and then we're going to firm it. We're going to get better and better at the high tech. And what we really need to do is focus on Iran. We have to focus on the existential threat to the country and so Bibi Netanyahu, who is focused on Iran, would prefer not to have to think about Hamas if he can help it. He's on the geopolitical stage. He's doing the Abraham Accords. He doesn't want to have to focus on Hamas or the West Bank if he can help it, because that doesn't advance Israel's largest interest or his understanding of what he's doing as prime minister. And the concepcia is the thing that is the ultimate thing that links everybody together, that I said at the beginning of the podcast, means that they're all compromised, and that
Yeah.
history, that Israeli history will say that the leadership of the country from 2010 to 2023, everybody was uh, guilty to some extent of the failures that led to October 7th.
Yes, I think it's right, and it's a weird thing that sort of like a ball that's rolling gets it gets bigger and bigger. I mean, it's a sort of so you have this. It is the Iran stuff. You're absolutely right. They're thinking about that, and even though, of course, looking back, you think, well, Hamas and which is a state really of many kinds, and they're terrified of the Abraham Accords and are likely to try and stop it if they can. There's very few ways of them, and they as are their Iranian friends, and so they were trying to figure out a way of doing it, and they that was part of the goal of their mission. So, but no one wanted to. They were being underestimated. The idea is that they're stupid, and even though, of course, eventually they had learned to stop talking on the phone and all the rest of it. But so that while they're being underestimated, that's a part of it. But one of the reasons why they didn't think they had to take care of and worry about Hamas, Bibi, and all the others and have this system, as you say, where you do a punitive raid every 2 or 3 years when they get difficult, and you're getting better at shooting down their missiles, is because there's been this running down of the IDF's ground forces since the beginning of the century, with the exception of Gabi Ashkenazi. You have a succession of chiefs of staff and defense ministers wanted to cut the military generally. The finance people wanted to cut the military generally, and it's like, well, we don't really need it. It's the old, this is stuff from the old world. We don't need any of this crap anymore. And we have these amazing, shiny, fantastic things, and it's boring and difficult to have to train up conscripts into decent troops. Let's not do it. And we've got this amazing air force. We've got incredible intelligence. Our cyber people are fantastic, and we have our special forces. Wouldn't it be great if we could just spend all the money on that? And that's what they did. And running down the rest of it starts really early on. And when you don't have as good, when you know that your people aren't really that good at the other stuff, you don't even want to think about using that stuff. You think we'll have to figure out some way around it. Our intelligence people will warn us anyway because they're amazing, and they are amazing. But you know what I mean. You don't have to be wrong once, really, don't you? And it's we'll deal with our
or ignore it. They knew, right? The intelligence was there. They had the intelligence that this was happening, and they just didn't.
So similar to 73 in some ways. It's so similar, except really it was one man there who sort of blocked it. But the difference is that the core Israeli military was in much better shape in 73. Those reservists were amazing. You know what I mean? They were they didn't have that stuff. And there wasn't this weird attitude. This weird thing, we don't need sentries anymore because our AIs will tell us when we're under attack, that kind of thing. And also, this isn't in the piece, but one of the things I did notice there, and I'm sure because you know Israel very well, is the sort of, there's the whole drug culture and everyone smokes all that weed and all the rest of it. And you just think, you can't help wondering, like, with the people who are watching, how many of these guys who are supposed to be keeping watch were like, getting high somewhere? Do you know what I mean? It's a sort of
then there's the flip side, though. You don't talk about this, which is that the Nova Festival, which I think, as you point out, it's not clear that Hamas even knew that the Nova Festival was taking place. So they had this other battle. They had just this other free shot at unarmed civilians by the hundreds who were were doing a rave in the in the Gaza envelope. But there's an interesting flip side to the story, which is that a bunch of people who were at the Nova Festival, not a bunch, like half of them were veterans, had been through universal conscription, were IDF soldiers. And they actually, unlike if that happened at Coachella, when the F Palestine thing comes out, they knew what to do. Like, the training kicked in. They weren't armed. But a lot of them figured out how to hide, where to go, how to, there was this population of Israelis who saved themselves and others who would likely have been killed en masse otherwise. Yeah. So and you point out that the behavior of the Israeli citizenry that lived in the Gaza envelope or around this, around those cities and the kibbutzim and moshavim was kind of staggering. Like their heroism and their self-sacrifice and bravery while they waited for the cavalry, literally didn't show up for 24 hours. And there was that amazing scene of the IDF chief of staff going to, is it Barry or Kfar? I can't remember which kibbutz went to, and this woman saying, "Where were you?
Yeah.
Where were you? We were barricaded inside our. Where were you? This is Israel. Like we're an hour and a half from Tel Aviv.
It's so
Where
small.
were you?"
And it's still baffling. I mean, it takes a long time to get. It takes longer than people imagine to get stuff together. I mean, that is the
No,
thing.
right.
You find people and they're on holiday and they're not answering their phones. And although it's easier now than it was in '73 because everyone does have phones. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But still, it's like it is easy. But it is. There must have been such confusion. And like I remember interviewing one of these special forces guys who was a reservist, who was sent down mid-morning, and they thought. And they knew that the regular people had already gone down, which is a squadron of 10 or whatever it is. They still thought they were dealing with an infiltration of 5 or 10 people. I mean, they just somehow didn't get through the size of this thing. And there were reports coming from all these different places, but there's sort of no one in charge. The people who are supposed to be in charge are in the Reim headquarters, which has also been overrun. And somehow there's no backup. There's no way of figuring, there was no, they'd taken
And you
out.
said that no one was sort of collating all the reports to put together this larger picture.
Millions of calls coming in. No one's doing that because that's what the Reim base is supposed to do. And somehow there's no one in. It's so unexpected. There's no one in charge. No one's saying, "Oh my God, if this has come up, but these WhatsApp calls are coming in." WhatsApp helps save things, by the way.
Yeah.
If they hadn't had the WhatsApp, I mean, they had helicopter gunships that came in. Were calling people on WhatsApp, and they got it's over there. You know what I mean? Go and do it. I mean, without that, I don't know what would have happened. I mean,
the one of the scariest statistics you say is that because you say that began at a certain kibbutz at, let's say, 8 a.m. or that's when the first calls for help went out. They came at 3 p.m. And you mentioned that this place is a 2.5-hour drive from Lebanon.
Yeah.
So the Israelis who are thinking about, right, they're not thinking about Hamas enough, maybe because they're thinking about the threat from Lebanon. You start to imagine, I mean, you don't want to, but perhaps how much worse, believe it or not, this could have been had, there been had Hezbollah been part of, that.
And I think that's what Sinwar probably was actually banking on.
Oh, he was. He thought Hezbollah would just like in '67 that there would be a multi-front war, and if there were a multi-front war and Iran decided to involve itself, then Israel really could fall.
Oh yeah, and if you have a simultaneous attack from the West Bank and possibly Arab risings in some of the cities, then you're in a whole.
No, you can see how things taken a twist the other way. But, the Complacency even went on 4 or 5 days later. I mean, that's a fascinating conversation between Dan Senor and Yoav Gallant on his podcast.
I'm going to check it out.
Gallant explains that he was one of the people who wanted, after October 7th, wanted Israel to attack Hezbollah. A little like after 9/11, you remember that Paul Wolfowitz and others said, we need to attack Iraq. We need to go after Iraq in the immediate wake of 9/11. Not that Hezbollah isn't a more direct threat and that there was reason to, but what Gallant said was, we have the walkie-talkie. Like we've had this project for years to blow up the walkie-talkies, and we can press a button and take out thousands of Hezbollah fighters and then go in and mop up and fight and do this. And we have it. It's off the shelf. We can do it. And it was left to Bibi to say to him, we can't attack the people who didn't attack us on October 7th. We have to go at the people who attacked us on October 7th. Like, get this in your head. He didn't say it this way, but it's like, let's just make this clear. We have a task to get the people who and no one's going to understand why we're shooting up here instead of down there. It doesn't
Yeah.
make any sense. And that's where that's where this world in which the divide between what's actually happening in the world and what happens when you're sitting in your headquarters thinking about things on a map as a and in this kind of geopolitical way, as opposed to our country was attacked by this force, we have to go attack this force. That's how it works. Like we have to, so that other people don't attack us later, right? So that the Concepcia began 10 years early and continued in some ways
Yeah. And like that,
until Israel went in earnest about 2 weeks after October
yeah.
7th.
And they had to build up to do that. And you just think, well, the other thing is, of course, is, I mean, things that there's amazing heroism and all the rest of it. The other thing is, it's a war. I mean, it could have been worse. We now know. I mean, what if they had a conventional attack from? What if the Egyptians had a coup and then sent their army in? You know what I mean? It's like they wouldn't have been ready. They couldn't handle a brigade from Gaza. They're
Right,
definitely not going to handle the Egyptian army. I mean,
right,
it's so they've got to get their act together in that sense, and
yeah,
they can, and I think they will. Hopefully, although I mean, it's in the piece, the thing about where they're still not training the conscripts properly. It's like they've got to,
right.
that's got to be
Well,
good.
I mean, they are. Look, the situation as it stands, and we're now in the weeks of. There is a conversation going on in Israel about whether or not there is going to be a massive, full scale assault on Gaza, in which the reservists are all going to be called up again, and that they're going to go for a final push, and effectively say we've done everything we could to try to save the hostages. Now we just have to end this and end it thoroughly, and find every tunnel and blow up every tunnel,
Yeah,
and and reoccupy parts of Gaza and all of that. And this conversation is now taking place, and I know from my own family and others that the reservists, many of whom are pushing 40, are exhausted. They are when you're a reservist, they have kids, they have wives, they have jobs, they have
yeah,
homes they have to keep up. They've been in for a couple hundred days since October 7th, and now you're going to reactivate them and move them in because, as you say, the standing army that Israel is supposed to have is insufficient to the task
yeah,
ahead. That probably shouldn't be the case.
yeah,
I mean, it's not Switzerland. They do have a standing army.
yeah,
It's not that in Switzerland everybody is in the military, right? So in theory, if Switzerland is ever attacked, everyone takes the gun they are obliged to have legally in their homes and goes out and starts shooting people in the street. But they've done that already, and they can't. I mean, obviously, if there's an existential threat, I don't think Bibi's speech over the weekend, I think, was intended to work up the Israelis to understand that this might happen again. And I don't think there's going to be like a mass revolt against, but the story about the reservists is a lot of them aren't reporting back for their reserve duty. They can't afford to. Their
yeah,
businesses are going to collapse. Their
yeah.
jobs are, their mother is on dialysis and no one can drive her to the doctor. Like this is, you can't
Yes,
disrupt an entire nation can't be at war like this in a first world country forever.
you're right. Of course, it's like that's the big downside of this whole citizen army thing. I mean, it's great, but you can't. The cost must be.
But
How
it's not
do
it's
you
not
calculate
supposed to last for 18 months. That's the whole point.
Yeah,
Israel's longest war had been
yeah, of
4
course.
weeks or 6 weeks.
They need a bigger conventional army. I mean, it
Well,
or
they're going to
something.
have a bigger conventional army. I mean, it's hard to have a bigger conventional army. They do have
Yes.
universal conscription. So
And
it's not as though every Israeli. Well, that's why there's a big fight over the religious Jews and the religious Jewish exemption, because it's several 100,000 people have never served they get this religious exemption. And but nonetheless, I don't think that would turn the tide.
what's
It's
your
just
what's your family's take as people who live there on this whole question? Because it's hard, I find it difficult to understand the whole thing about.
nobody except the Haredim think that it is anything but an absolute monstrous, nauseating, sickening outrage that they do not have to serve. I mean, I don't know. Seth is more attuned to the Orthodox community's feelings about these things, but I mean, I have never heard anyone, and I'm talking about very right wing Israelis and people who like are, you know, who like doesn't start to shake with rage when the subject comes up.
So yesterday, Bezalel Smotrich got into a fight with the Haredim when he was, meeting with them, they were criticizing Smotrich. Again, when we talk about very right wing people, that's why I bring him up. They were criticizing him for having said that the hostages, the return of the remaining hostages, are not the first priority, not the top priority in the war. And he said back to them, then send your kids to battle. Like, how could he was looking, it was a room full of Haredim, and he was saying, like, well, how can you tell me, you're telling me what the priorities for the war are, and you want the war to go on and do this and this and this, contribute to it, right? So I think that it is something that is below the surface, right? If you're within the right wing coalition and within the religious coalition, it's sort of you keep a lid on it because you have this coalition, but it is there. And even if you're Bezalel Smotrich, at the first opportunity that somebody comes at you, you're going to respond with, then join the party.
I mean,
It,
it's also this sort of, what is the attitude, by the way, also about the hostages? I mean, you do get the sense that at least half the Israeli public, or many more, has always thought the hostage, that's has restrained, it has made things.
well, Bibi, look, there's a horrible, I think, actually, look, God, whatever, fate, karma. Bibi Netanyahu is being blamed for things that he should not be blamed for, and is not being blamed for things that he might maybe be blamed for. And the main one is that he has restrained Israel from winning the war because of the hostages. That is an absolute fact. The war has been conducted in a way to maximize the possibility of getting the hostages out before they're all killed, in a way that has been extremely injurious to Israel's larger aims. And he is responsible for that. And his reward for that is being accused of prolonging the war for his own political purposes, which is unbelievably unjust. And yet, because of the failures that he is responsible for, it's a little hard to feel sorry for him, even if you hold the view that I hold here. And similarly, if you're a pollster and you ask an Israeli, do you want the hostages home or do you want to win the war? If you pose it as an either or, it is still the case that the Israelis say 60% or more that they want the hostages home. But we don't know, because I know from everybody I know who talks about this, whether that is actually something that they think or whether they cannot say otherwise. Because in this generation, let it be as though I have a hostage family member in Egypt. Like that is the feeling, and that it would be somehow a betrayal
Yeah.
of this idea that could be my kid, for you to
Yeah.
say, we've done as much as we can do and we have to win this war because 9 million people need this war to be over. Whereas 20 living hostages are making that impossible, and that this trade-off is now become too costly. But you can't get that data. You know what I mean? You can't, there's
Yeah.
no there's no way for that to be expressed because people can't say it. They can't say it.
I mean, when you think that they get, what about the families? You go, yeah, well, then there's the families of the people of all the other people who've been killed, quite apart from the
Yeah.
civilians, and the rest of it. What about them? How many of them were up to rescue the 20? I mean,
Yeah.
it's a morally complicated
Well,
question.
I'm
Yeah, you
I'm
have
I'm, I'm
families
gonna
like family cracking, right? Family
yeah.
units
Oh yeah.
crack. I mean,
Oh
we
yeah.
all know people who are like, the husband has had to go back 4 times
Yeah.
now in this war, and she's got all the kids at home, and it's not like she's angry at him for being a soldier. It is a citizen army, but it's just you can't you nurture your
A
home
citizen army never
like that.
envisioned an 18-month long war.
Yeah.
That is not what a citizen army in a tiny country expects, is a war of attrition. It's not really a war of attrition. It's weird because it stops and starts and goes and whatever. But but I will conclude, because I've told this story intermittently. Uh, tell a story from yesterday about my nephew Alone, who is 40 years old and has been since 2004 a soldier and then a reservist in the in the Givati Brigade, one of the main Israeli sort of elite fighting units. Helped while as he wept pull people from the Gaza settlements when in 2005 when Sharon ordered the dismantling of the Gaza settlements, and was back in Gaza in 2009 and 2014. I believe in 2019 was in the war in Lebanon. He's almost 40 years old. He's divorced. He has two kids. He was back in Gaza for almost 200 days from October 7th onward. He had a business, a high-tech business that he had to fold because it was him and his partner and a couple people, and they were serving their country. So his professional career was damaged, and he was nearly killed 4 months ago in a 5 months ago in a raid that saw three people in his convoy killed, including two of his closest friends killed. He was injured on his hand. Yesterday, there was a ceremony in Ashkelon for distinguished combat veterans of this war, in which he was, for the second time, honored for his service and his sacrifice. And it was extraordinarily moving. His children got to see him celebrated. His children, who were 9 and 7, 9 and 6, 9 and 7, I can't remember, but have suffered through his absences, and his everybody was there, and it's really was a wonderful tribute to him. And he does not have to return. I mean, he's sort of like, he's done his time, and he is 40, and 40 is really the cutoff point. I don't know what he'll do if there is a major call up. It will be up to him to go or not to go. But he just give you a sense of what this life can be like. A divorced man with a promising startup business with two children, whose life has been dominated since October 7th by the need to do something that no one ever anticipated a 40-year-old man would have to do, which is fight in a war for 2 years or 18 months or whatever. And Evelyn Waugh's great trilogy, the Sword of Honor trilogy novels, deal with the comedy of Guy Crouchback, basically his autobiographical character, who joins in World War II and is called Granddad by his conscripts because he's so old. And I don't think I think he's 38, if I remember correctly in the novel. So he's younger than Alone. Now, Alone is not leading. Alone is part of a reserve unit with people around his age or people like that. But I mean, this is not the way it is supposed to be. And Israel can't go on like, and one of the many reasons why they will take the measure of all this is because everyone in the country wants to know why this happened and how it can never happen again, and what they can do not only to make sure it never happens again, but to reorganize the entire military approach to the future so that their lives aren't destroyed by the need to defend themselves in this way. Because it's one thing to have to pay really high taxes, which Israelis do, and to sacrifice and to see your children go off into the military for 3 years, which they do, maybe to fight a hot war, which they have, and to suffer through this experience. And it's another to say your entire life is now turned over into military service for an indeterminate period of time. That can't happen again. I don't think. Anyway, Johnny, so the piece, very important, as I say, the untold story of how Israel failed on October 7th, cover story of our May issue. You can read it at commentary.com. Very proud to have published it. Very important summa of all of this, and it is very important, even if you are extraordinarily supportive of the war and of Israel's efforts and disgusted by the propagandistic, the fact that there's now a new encampment that's gone up at Yale overnight, a sign that the evil of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is still alive and well and kicking in amongst our elites, and that this is going to make Jews less safe and Israel less safe over time. Even so, it is important for lovers of Israel, fans of Israel, or people who just to understand this, because it goes to everything we know about how people fight wars and win wars and lose wars. And this is a sort of an object lesson in an incredibly open society having to start reckoning with what went wrong, since the societies where things mostly have gone wrong, I mean, unless, often are closed. And so we don't know what went wrong in the Soviet Union, in Afghanistan, right? We don't know. We'll never know because they burned everything. But
what's that stat that Israel has the highest per capita rate of journalists of any country in the world?
Something like that.
Yeah, it's something like, and psychiatrists, by the way, which is interesting. Anyway, so great piece. Please go to commentary.org and read it. Please subscribe to Commentary by going to the subscribe button. Start paying. You can read Johnny Foreman, read him in the future. Go look at our archives, read pieces he's written in the past. By the way, important piece that you wrote that is still reverberating in our time, like wrote the first piece, I think, in the American Prince about the Rotherham grooming scandal in 2013, 2014, which, is still playing this outsized role in British politics. So you could read that if you just search Jonathan Foreman's name. Anyway, it's great to have you. Great to see you. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see that there's he's right over Johnny's shoulder is a table of children who appear to be playing a game in a Dutch master style painting. At a table with the lederhosen and stuff. Anyway, so
it's been a pleasure.
From Barcelona.
Yeah, goodbye from me in Barcelona. It's lovely to see you guys.
It's lovely to see you too. And so for Abe and Seth, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.